Thank you, Kristen, for that introduction, and thank you very much to the organisers and to President Grimson as well for inviting us to present to you here today. So, as Kristen mentioned, I propose to give a brief overview of the EU policy towards the Arctic region, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Elisabetta Vignati from the Joint Research Centre, and she'll speak in a little bit more detail about scientific support that the EU provides within the framework of its Arctic policy. So, see if the technology works. So, the EU and the Arctic. The EU has a significant interest in what happens in the Arctic. 3 EU member states, Denmark via Greenland, Finland and Sweden, have territories in the Arctic. 2 other Arctic states, Iceland and Norway, are members of the European Economic Area. The EU has important relationships with the US, Canada and Russia. It is engaged in a number of regional cooperation formats that cover the Arctic region. It participates as an ad hoc observer at the Arctic Council, primary forum for Arctic regional cooperation. It's a member of the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, a forum for intergovernmental cooperation in the Barents region, covering northern parts of Finland, Norway, Russia, and Sweden. And it works within the framework of the Northern Dimension, a common policy between the EU, Russia, Norway, and Iceland, aimed at promoting dialogue and cooperation with a focus on economic integration and sustainable development. Finally, the EU is a strong supporter of the rules-based international system and an important negotiating force in multilateral fora on key issues impacting the Arctic region, such as climate change and environmental protection. The EU and the Arctic are closely interconnected. Actions taken within the EU impact the Arctic, and the changes affecting the Arctic in turn have an impact on the EU. Detailed information on the EU's impact on the Arctic can be found in the report of the EU Arctic Footprint and Policy Assessment Project, published in early 2011, which outlines the significant impact that the EU has on the socio-economic and environmental aspects of the Arctic region. So, a few examples. The EU is a major source of black carbon deposited in the Arctic. It is responsible for 16% of greenhouse gas emissions and 42% of sulfur dioxide emissions in the Arctic. The EU therefore has a responsibility to work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and persistent organic pollutants. On the other hand, the European Union, individual EU member states, and the EU private sector invest heavily in the Arctic region. The EU is the largest consumer of goods and products from the Arctic. 39% of fish exports, for example, from the region go to EU markets. And the EU is a major source of tourists visiting the Arctic region, and this number is growing. A whole range of EU policies impact the Arctic region, including climate change, environmental protection, research, maritime affairs and fisheries, trade, transport, energy, and regional cooperation. The Arctic, therefore, is an area where the EU's internal and external policies meet. It is important that EU policies are coherent. In particular, we need to find the correct balance between responding to climate change and protecting the fragile environment on the one hand, while on the other respecting the legitimate aspirations of Arctic inhabitants to sustainable development of the region. A number of EU funding instruments are operating in the Arctic. I'll mention just a few of these. The European Regional Development Fund, between 2007 and 2013, invested €243 million in the North Sweden programme and €177 million in the Mid-North Sweden programme, aimed at increasing the competitiveness of these regions. In the same period, the EU contributed €313 million to the Northern Finland programme. The Coal-Arctic programme is a cross-border cooperation programme between North Culloden and Northwest Russia, financed under the European Neighbourhood and Partnership Instrument. The general objective of this programme is to decrease the peripheral aspects of the border regions of the participating countries and to enhance multilateral cooperation. The Northern Periphery programme, involving Ireland, Finland, Sweden and the UK, as well as the Faroe Islands, Greenland, Iceland and Norway, also with the possibility of participation from Canada and Russia, aims to help remote communities in Northern Europe develop their economic, social and environmental potential. The Horizon 2020 programme is the biggest EU research and innovation programme ever, with a budget of nearly €80 billion available over the next 7 years. The Instrument for Greenland will provide €217 million over this funding period, focused on education and training. And within the framework of the Northern Dimension, the EU has, over the years, contributed close to €100 million, the largest share of this being devoted to the Northern Dimension Environmental Partnership Support Fund. So this is just to give a sense of the number of instruments that actually are working to support the Arctic region. So in summary, I would say EU's objectives in the Arctic are protecting and preserving the Arctic in unison with its population, promoting the sustainable use of resources, and contributing to Arctic cooperation. I think I'm just going to run through the next 3 slides very quickly because a lot of people over the last few days have talked about the changes impacting the Arctic, which I think we're all fairly familiar with at this stage, which bring with them opportunities, but also risks. And those risks obviously need to be managed. So I will move on, I think, and just very briefly take you through the history of the EU's Arctic policy. The EU is a relative newcomer to Arctic policy. The first communication on the EU Arctic policy, entitled The European Union and the Arctic Region, was issued in 2008. This document recognized the growing strategic importance of the region and highlighted for the first time the extent of the EU's engagement in the Arctic. This was followed in 2012 by a joint communication by the EU High Representative and the Commission, developing European Union policy towards the Arctic region. This document analysed progress since 2008 and set out the EU's priorities for the region, structured around 3 pillars: knowledge, responsibility, and engagement. Knowledge. The EU is one of the biggest contributors to Arctic research. Over the past decade, around €200 million has been invested in research projects covering a broad range of areas, from environment, climate, health, sea mining, and fisheries, to the development of opportunities for new economic activities and access to Arctic research infrastructures. The EU plans to maintain a similar level of funding under the financing programme 2014 to 2020. Already, under the Horizon 2020 work programme for 2016 to 17, a €40 million package of investments in Arctic research and innovation has been proposed. The EU has recently launched EU PolarNet, the world's largest international consortium of expertise and infrastructure for polar research, which provides a unique platform for increasing scientific cooperation, bringing together scientists from the EU, US, Canada, and Russia. And for those of you that were here yesterday, there was a presentation on the EU PolarNet. The Galway Declaration of May 2013 established the Transatlantic Ocean Research Alliance between the EU, US, and Canada, which inter alia addresses Arctic research. And finally, EU space programs, which are currently being deployed, provide the invisible infrastructure on the basis of which activities in the Arctic can be undertaken safely, efficiently, and with minimal impact on the fragile environment. Satellite navigation based on Galileo will, for example, greatly support new shipping routes and activities related to exploration and exploitation of natural resources. Copernicus provides information on the ice, ocean, and atmosphere on a daily basis and can be considered a key tool contributing to the development of environmental policies in the Arctic region. My colleague Elisabetta will address EU research in the Arctic in more detail. Responsibility. So responsibility essentially can be summarized from our perspective as managing the Arctic's resources in a sustainable and safe manner, development of environmental friendly low-risk technologies, and respecting the values, interests, cultures, and traditions of Arctic Indigenous peoples and other Arctic inhabitants. Engagement. The EU is committed to cooperation with the Arctic states, Indigenous peoples, and other key stakeholders to arrive at common solutions to the issues impacting the region. EU experts are actively participating in relative meetings of the Arctic Council structures. We heard this morning from the US delegation on their ambitious programme for their chairmanship of the Arctic Council, and we look forward to working closely with them on the priority areas they have identified. As I mentioned already, regional cooperation on Arctic issues has also been taken forward within the framework of the Barents Sea Arctic Council, the Northern Dimension. And finally, the EU will continue to promote international cooperation and engagement to address the challenges of the Arctic region, including respect for the rules-based international system in resolving any disputes that may arise. So I will now just briefly run through some of the EU's contribution to date. Climate change. The EU is leading the way in efforts to combat the impacts of climate change. EU member states have committed to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by at least 40% by 2030 based on 1990 levels. This commitment will continue to reduce the EU's CO2 footprint in the Arctic. At the COP21 negotiations in Paris in December, the EU is committed to ensuring the adoption of a legally binding, ambitious and fair international agreement, acceptable to all and capable of keeping the world on track to limit the global temperature increase to below 2 degrees. The EU recognises the challenge for local and Indigenous communities in adapting to climate change. Adaptation strategies and best practices are being collected and shared as part of the EU strategy on adaptation to climate change. The EU is also the biggest donor of international climate finance and provided €9.5 billion in 2013 alone. Overall, in the period 2007 to 2013, the EU has invested €1.14 billion to develop the economic, social, and environmental potential of the Arctic region. I'd like to just briefly mention the Northern Periphery and Arctic programme, the new programme that's running from 2014 to 20, which provides investment opportunities specifically for the Arctic and Northern regions. It involves 9 partner countries: Finland, Ireland, Sweden, the UK, in cooperation with the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and Norway. And this programme area essentially shares a number of common features, such as low population density, low accessibility, low economic diversity, abundant natural resources, and a high impact of climate change. The programme aims to generate vibrant, competitive, and sustainable communities through transnational cooperation. It will allocate approximately €56 million to projects, with a maximum total budget of €2 million per project. So I would encourage you to have a look at it, and the third call is now open up until November. I was speaking at an event on Thursday, and somebody rightly asked me what exactly the EU does for Indigenous people. So I thought I would include this slide, which indicates some of the initiatives. Overall, the EU seeks to integrate human rights and Indigenous issues into all aspects of its internal and external policies. And we're currently undertaking a review of our Indigenous policy, which will be finalised next year. The EU engages in regular dialogue with Arctic Indigenous communities, notably via the annual dialogue held in Brussels every year. This is an opportunity to hear from Indigenous peoples the issues of concern to them and to outline relevant EU policies and funding programmes. And the next dialogue will be held in January. The EU has provided financial support to civil society organisations working on Indigenous issues, in particular through the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. The European Commission in 2014 commissioned a study on Arctic lay and traditional knowledge, the purpose of which was to identify community-based monitoring and observing programmes in the European Arctic and collect basic information on them. And you can find the results of this study on the website of the Commission. Between 2007 and 2013, the European Regional Development Fund set aside €4.3 million in the cross-border Sami sub-programme to support the Sami population developing its cultural life and industry in a sustainable manner. So, what next for EU Arctic policy? Well, the European Parliament last year called for united EU policy on the Arctic and a coherent strategy and a concretised action plan on the EU's engagement in the Arctic with a focus on socio-economic and environmental issues. EU foreign ministers in May 2014 requested the Commission and the High Representative to present proposals for the further development of an integrated and coherent Arctic policy. So we're now working on this new policy document with the objective of ensuring that EU policies, actions and instruments are adapted to the ongoing changes in the Arctic region. We've engaged in a broad consultation process. The Commission conducted an online public consultation between September and December 2014. A series of regional workshops on specific aspects of Arctic policy were held in Rovaniemi, Oslo, and here in Reykjavik between April and June 2015, and these looked at specific sectoral aspects of our policy. And finally, a conference was held in Brussels in June, which brought together a range of stakeholders: government, policy, academia, representatives of Indigenous peoples, and NGOs to discuss what the focus of the EU's Arctic policy should be for the period ahead. So taking into account the views expressed by various stakeholders, it's clear that the fundamental priorities of the EU's Arctic policy will remain the same, with a focus on climate change and environmental protection, sustainable development in the Arctic region, international cooperation, and a cross-cutting theme of research and innovation, supporting all of the above priorities. So that is, as I say, a brief overview. I'd be happy to take some questions at the end if we have time. Thank you for your attention.